Following the turn of the century, city life grew as Southern African Americans flocked to the industrious life in the North. However, as the Great Depression brought widespread unemployment, unions were formed, riots spurred throughout urban areas, and the federal government played a powerful role controlling opportunities for work and wages for many.
In 1900, the condition of African American laborers remained similar to that in 1875. 90% of African Americans still remained in the South, and over 50% of African Americans remained in agriculture. The others were spread thinly across a wide range of professions, with the highest concentration being non-agriculture hard labor. Less than 50% of African Americans attended school, and less than 1% held a position in management. This was soon to change. By 1916, boll weevils and floods had destroyed most of the southern cotton fields, leaving African American farmers, many of whom had invested heavily in cotton, without a source of income. Also, the involvement of the United States in the First World War led to the deployment of many white troops, depleting the northern supply of white laborers. So employers turned to the black population of the South for workers, and thus began the Great Migration. In cities, black workers had access to a limited set of jobs and remained heavily in unskilled labor positions. Workers only gained admittance to a limited set of firms, thus, because of their limited alternatives, African American workers could be put in very dangerous settings. They were often placed in killing and cutting areas of meatpacking plants, foundry departments and auto plants, and blast furnaces and steel plants, where one mistake could result in injury or death. Northern cities became more segregated as more African Americans moved in. Racial tensions became apparent and sometimes evolved into violence. An example would be in the summer of 1919, also known as the Red Summer, 26 race riots occurred in cities such as Tulsa and Chicago, and more than 100 African Americans were killed and thousands were wounded and left homeless.
In 1925, the Coolidge administration attempted to aid African American workers by establishing the Division of Negro Affairs as a new branch of the Commerce Department. However, this new branch was not taken seriously by the government, and its proposals for furthering the development of African American professionals were often regarded as racially biased and were not carried through. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, the American Communist Party began supporting and improving the condition of African American professionals. This support would continue into the 1950s, when the government would crack down on the communists.
The Great Depression was the longest-lasting economic decline in the history of the United States. Although people of all backgrounds suffered, African Americans experienced the Depression much sooner than the rest of the nation. The effects the Great Depression had on African Americans was staggering. By 1939, 80% of the black population in the South made less than $1,000 per year, keeping them right at the poverty line. Hatred for African Americans increased during this time of stress, and slogans such as "No jobs for N-word until every white man has a job" were thrown around. All the while, the Hoover administration did little to help those who were suffering. In 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt stepped into office and opposed legislation such as the Anti-Lynching Bill, a critical bill for the civil rights. During his time in office, Roosevelt established New Deal agencies which were created with the goal of combating the Great Depression. However, these agencies neglected to protect African Americans against discrimination from employers. One of the agencies, the National Recovery Administration, removed about 60% of African Americans from benefits. By the mid-1930s, African Americans began to instill change, and by 1939, they occupied about one-third of federal housing projects. Income from New Deal agencies matched their income from private employment, and they obtained a bigger share of benefits and jobs.
As the United States entered into the Great Depression, large portions of the male workforce left for war, creating a need for women to fill these voids. Because racism was still paramount in society, these jobs in industries and factories went almost exclusively to white women. Because of this, many African American women lost their jobs as domestic servants, as the white women were leaving their households to work. With so many unemployed workers, many African American women living in urban areas were forced into these so-called slave markets, where they begged on street corners for work that usually offered barely survivable wages. The NRA made it even more difficult for female workers, as some codes specifically dictated men to receive higher wages than women in industrial jobs, which forced many women to flock to jobs like teaching, nursing, and domestic service, if they were available. As most were unable to find a job, many African American women spent their time supporting both their families and communities by working with white women in local organizations to control rent, food prices, and gather relief payments. In the 1930s, African American housewives leagues began to spring up throughout the country. Highly influential, these leagues created canvasses, negotiations, and boycotts to convince local businesses to hire African American employees. Nationally, these leagues created roughly 75,000 jobs for African Americans. However, in the South, the workforce was primarily agricultural, so 44% of African American women were farm workers, and therefore labor associations and local organizations were not as common.
When the United States entered the Second World War in 1941, many more African Americans migrated from the South to the North. However, unlike the First World War, many unemployed whites still remained in the North, left over from the Great Depression, and companies turned to them instead of the new migrants. The situation worsened to the point where whites went on hate strikes when African Americans attempted to join companies. After an African American threat to march on Washington in 1941, President Roosevelt established the Fair Employment Practices Committee, which investigated discrimination cases and created equal employment laws. Around this time, too, we see the first emergence of affirmative action programs, beginning with the International Harvesters Company's non-discrimination policy.
The period of great wars opened up a whole new world for African Americans, and the prospect for racial equality was better than ever. In the decades after the closing of the Second World War, the battle for civil rights began to gain momentum in America.